persistence enabled us to bring the commissioner here today. Dean Alex Acosta, of the Law School of UNIVERSITY, very generously co-sponsored this today's presentation, as did David Clark of the business school. I'm grateful to both the law faculty and the business faculty for their support of this event. Without further ado, let me ask Dean Costa to come to introduce this afternoon's speaker.
Thank you, and I want to reiterate the thanks to Professor Gabilondo. It's really nice when faculty give back. The proceeds of this corporate finance book are actually being used to endow and to fund this lecture series, and I guess it's in the name of his professor, Bobby Barton, who taught me tax at Berkeley. So I think it's especially meaningful to have a faculty member credit their professor. Maybe all of you could do that in a few years as well. So I just wanted to say thank you again. And I also wanted to, I guess it's my pleasure to introduce Commissioner Mike Pivovar. I'll get to the formal introductions in a minute, but as we were chatting, something that I thought was interesting is that Commissioner Pivovar is only the third SEC commissioner who's a trained economist as opposed to a lawyer. And that's why I think this is so interesting. As you look back on SEC history, there have been some lawsuits against the SEC, some Administrative Procedure Act issues, whether or not they're using economic analysis or not, and those get resolved in the courts of law, and that's one mechanism for addressing and resolving these things. But another mechanism that government has is to think, what do we want in our commissions? You want diversity in all its forms. You want diversity of background, of ethnicity, of race. But something that maybe folks don't think about is to not have everyone be a lawyer. Diversity of perspective, having an economist, I think this must bring a very different perspective to the commission. And I guess I wanted to highlight that he's obviously incredibly qualified. He was the counsel, the Senate counsel, that worked on the 4 SEC-related titles of Dodd-Frank. And so, now he's in the enforcement role, working on the laws that he helped write when he was working in the Senate committee. So he's seen the Senate side, he's now doing the enforcement side. He's an economist working with a lot of lawyers and bringing a different perspective. Obviously incredibly qualified. He's been a professor. He's been a Senate staffer. And so rather than do the formal introduction, I just wanted to sort of give what I think is a really interesting background, almost a unique background that the commissioner brings to the table, and to really thank him for coming to FIU. We're a new school relative to the Northeast Corridor. We're only 10 years as opposed to 200 years, but we're already top 100, and it's something we're incredibly proud of. So thank you for being here, Commissioner. Great. Thank you.
Too, for endowing this lecture series. It's actually very much of a pleasure to be here today. So what I thought I'd do today is give you a little bit of perspective in terms of, as the Dean was mentioning, how an economist thinks, and give a little bit of history, a little bit of humanities flavor to it, a little bit of legal flavor to it, because it's the Center for Humanities in the Urban Environment, but it's the Barbie Barton lecture series on law and economics, and I'm a regulator, and so it's like, how can I mix this all together and actually try to make it as entertaining as possible? So what I thought I would do is sprinkle in a few jokes about economists, be some self-deprecating, but then also try to make the point across that economists are people too. So hopefully I'll get that point across as I go through in the lecture. But before I do anything, I always have to do this standard disclaimer written by a lawyer, which says that anything that I say during, any views that I express today during this lecture are my own and do not necessarily reflect any views of anyone else at the Commission or the Commission as a whole, right? And in fact, oftentimes the views I express, no one else has those same exact views. So we'll kind of go from there. So what I thought I'd start off with is some stereotypes about economists, right? So I understand that we have mostly lawyers in this room and maybe some other folks that are in the humanities and stuff. And so stereotype number one, I'll start off with a joke, right? So a physicist, a chemist, and an economist are on a deserted island, right? And a can of soup washes ashore. And the physicist says, great, let's take the can of soup and bash it against a rock and we can open it. And the chemist says, no, 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 no. Let's heat up the can and then it'll expand and the top will pop off. And the economist is just sitting there and they're like, what are you doing? He says, oh, it's easy. All we do is just assume a can opener, right? And sort of the stereotype with economists is that economists are sort of detached from the real world, come up with all these mathematical models that have no bearing in reality. And when economists are coming up with theories and they can't try to think of a way out, it's just, well, just assume a can opener and then you can kind of move on and nothing, and then, make absurd assumptions that we don't work in the real world, right? Another stereotype about economists, right? Priest, a rabbi, and an economist go golfing, right? And they tee off on the first hole, everything's great, there's no one in front of them. By the time they get to the third hole, there's a twosome in front of them, they're golfing and they see them out at the tee and it's taken them a while. And they say, all right, well that's fine. Perhaps they were just slow in this hole and they'll continue ahead. So they get to the fourth tee, same thing happens again. And they think, okay, well, etiquette would say that, maybe by the time we get to the next hole, these guys will let us play through. They're slow, they're gonna let us play through. And so they get to the fifth hole, they don't let them play through. The guys are still ahead, they're taking a long time, they're taking forever. And this goes on through all entire 18 holes. They don't let them play through. And the priest, the rabbi, and the economist are getting more and more steamed as they go through this. And by the time they're done, they're at the end, they're at the country club, they're at the clubhouse, they're having a drink, and they're still talking about, I can't believe those guys didn't let us play through, what the heck's going on? And one of the two from the twosome comes up to the priest, the rabbi, and the economist and says, listen guys, I want to apologize for what we did to you guys, for not letting you play through. But my buddy of mine who I was playing golf with just went blind about 6 months ago. He's been very depressed. This is the first time he's been out of the house. He thinks he's a burden on society, and he thinks that, if he was going to come out, he was going to slow people down. And I didn't want to have you guys play through because he would be more depressed and stuff. And so I really, really appreciate the fact that you guys were really, really patient. So the priest says, oh, geez, you know what? Here I am, a man of God. I'm so sorry. That's fine. And the rabbi says, oh, geez, here I am, a man of God. I'm so sorry. Don't worry about it. The economist stops and thinks about it and he goes, wait, he's blind? Couldn't he have played at night? Right? And so another sort of stereotype about economists is that, economists aren't like normal people, right? Almost like Spock from Star Trek, right? Think very, very logically about things, right? People fit into the formal models, right? For those of you that have taken economics classes, you do things like you maximize utilities, and we talk about maximize utility. We talk about things called utils that people try to maximize, and you crank through all these problems and stuff, and you assume that everybody works that way, and you end up with this like absurd view of what people are. There's this term called homo economicus, which is people act like they're maximizing utility. They're not very charitable. They don't think about others and those types of things, right? Those are two stereotypes of economists. But here's my claim. Very simple claim. If you get nothing out of this lecture, hopefully you leave the room with the following. Economists are people too. We're just a little bit different in the way that we think about the world, but we think about it in a good way. So hopefully we get that by the time you leave here. So what I thought I would do is sort of walk through some examples of that, historically looking at what some famous economists have said about the real world, which was very different than what the prevailing view was at the time, and how they actually shaped history, how people thought about things, and how those things apply here in the real world today. Okay? So the first person I thought I'd talk about is someone, Adam Smith, right? The father of modern economics, right? He's the one that wrote The Wealth of Nations in 1776. He talked about something called the invisible hand. But he was thinking about, at the time, things about like the public interest, how the public interest could best be served. Is it through people who say, all right, I want to serve the public interest, Or what he noted is he had phrases like the following: "It is not from the benevolence of the butcher, the brewer, or the baker that we expect our dinner, but from their regard to their own self-interest or their own interest." And so he was making the point here that, you know, most of us are fed not by charity. Charity's great, and he even talks about, and he has a book called The Theory of Moral Sentiments, and about how people care for each other and stuff. But he started observing in the real world, how is it that most economic activity or most things that benefit society occur? It's not through people trying to do things in the public interest, it's through people acting in their own self-interest. Now, this has, what he's been talking about here, has been sort of perverted by extremes on both sides of sort of the political debate. There are those that almost have religious views about what he was trying to say here, in terms of, some people say that, oh, well, what he's saying is that in all cases, the private interest, self-interest should win out, and there's no sense for regulation or legislation, right? That's absurd. We know that's not true. Other people throw out cases where they say, aha, it's the case that, you know, we can find instances where people acting in their own self-interest through greed or whatever, end up to the, harming individuals, and so we need, the government to run everything. Those are sort of perverted, sort of extreme views of what he was trying to say here. He was just trying to point out the fact that it is through their self-interest that we actually get things like our dinner. There are people who are served dinner by charity, right? But the vast majority of us is through people pursuing their own self-interest, right? An example today, right? We don't really have many butchers anymore, and we have butchers, bakers, and we have smartphone makers, right? And you think about what Steve Jobs did when he worked for Apple, right? He did a lot of things. He was thinking about trying to create products not only that we needed or that we wanted, but he was creating products to grow his company of things that we didn't even know we needed, right? And here's a simple example I found from the website BuzzFeed that showed some cool things about how technology has changed and how we have benefited from someone like him who's trying to grow his company and competing against other smartphone makers to create different products that are out there, right? So within 20 years, we went from having all these different pieces of technology all now collapsed into an iPhone from 1993 to 2013, right? Now, I'm looking around the room. Some of you weren't even born in 1993 and don't even remember this stuff. But I can remember in 1993, I thought the people that created those things were the smartest people in the world. They were like, I was really happy to have my Walkman, and I thought, my cassette tape in there was like the coolest thing I could walk around with. But, now we have folks that are competing with the iPhone, Samsung, and whatever, and it's not through their benevolence that we're getting really, really cool technology, and we can do all these things like have a camera and a laptop and a phone and a camera and a Walkman and a watch and a pager. And for those of you who don't know what pagers are, that was a precursor to like texting back in the day. All within one cool thing, and we're just going to continue to get progress in technology. Our lives are going to be better standards of living, not because some government agency said, all right, we're going to focus in industrial policy on developing a smartphone, but it's through people competing in the marketplace out there, right? And so this was somebody back in the 1700s that said, it's as if by an invisible hand we're promoting an end that was in part of no one's intention to make people's lives better, that our lives actually are better in this case. And so this was very different than what was happening in society back in the day. There was these people called the mercantilists, and they were trying to restrict trade among a bunch of people. There were people that said, well, because of these mercantilists are out there, we need the government to take over stuff. And Adam Smith was one who sort of pointed out things are not quite as the way they seem, and maybe are a little bit different. Now, how many of you have ever heard economics called the dismal science? Have you ever heard that phrase before? Right? There's a myth from where this actually came from, the term the dismal science, right? The myth is that the person who came up with this, Thomas Carlyle, it was named the dismal science because he followed someone named Thomas Malthus. And Thomas Malthus was also an economist who did some calculations. And what he did on the calculations, he noted population growth in certain places. And then he also made observations about a land that was available to grow crops and stuff. And he did some calculations and said, well, if everything continued on the current path that we're going to have, population is going to outstrip our ability to actually make food for ourselves. And he had this very, very gloomy prediction about what was going to happen that was very popular in the late 1700s, early 1800s, right? And in fact, every once in a while, that notion comes up again. In the 1960s, there were the people that were like, said, what, populations are getting too big in China and India and all these places, and we're going to have, there's going to be huge population growth, and we're going to run out of food and whatever, right? The fallacy in that argument is that you don't think about things of one, that population growth sort of kind of goes like this as societies, kind of goes down. As societies get better educated, standard of living goes up. And also, we have better technology in terms of growing food as well, too, so that goes up as well, too. And so, we're never going to really reach the point where this is going to come out. But people thought that that's why Carlyle came up with the term the dismal science. Now, it turns out that economics became known as the dismal science. People who didn't like economics were people who were actually pro-slavery in the 1800s. So what happened was the prevailing view at the time among a number of the intellectuals was that certain nations were poor because of there was differences in the races, and that some races were just naturally inferior, and so they weren't going to grow as fast as other ones, and then so that lent justification in their mind that you could have white plantation owners enslave Africans, for example. This was prevalent in England and in the United States, obviously, of course, right? But there were some economists who came around, like John Stuart Mill, and said, no, that's wrong. The obvious thing that may look like that's the thing is not the right one. He said it was institutions, not race, that explained why some nations were rich and some nations were poor. And so the economists, by going through and saying and digging deeper and trying to find out what the real answers were in terms of why there was cross-sectional differences across nations in terms of their economic development, it was institutions and not race that explained it. And so pro-slavery people like Thomas Carlyle said, these economists are coming in and they're ruining all our arguments for slavery. And so he was the one, that was how he named economics the dismal science, right? And that actually makes me proud to be an economist on that, right? They were making radical claims at the time that, the equality of men, right? At the time was very radical sorts of things. Now we think of as very, very normal things. And thus lending support to the abolitionists and the anti-slavery movement in the 1800s. Frederick Bastiat was a French mathematician and an economist, and he came up with this concept of what's called that which is seen and that which is not seen. And he wrote a number of essays. In one of the essays, he said, in the department of an economy, an act, a habit, an institution, a law, or maybe think of as a regulation, gives birth not only to an effect, but a series of effects. Of these effects, the first is only immediate. It manifests itself simultaneously with the cause. It is seen. The others unfold in succession. They are not seen. And it is well for us if they are foreseen. So as a point here was that when we think about regulations or legislation, oftentimes people think about the intended effect in terms of who is it benefiting in terms of what we're doing here, right? And they're oftentimes not seeing the unintended consequence, right? So if you think of things like the debate over the minimum wage, right? What is seen? Well, if you raise the minimum wage, what is seen is that individuals who have jobs and minimum wage jobs get higher wages. What is unseen? The potential for the fact that companies now have to pay each worker a higher amount may not hire as many workers, and so there may be people who are unemployed as a consequence of raising the minimum wage. What is also unseen? Well, companies who were paying lower wages could afford to spend more money on things like training for their workers to move up and get higher paying jobs in the future. Maybe they're spending less money on those. Now, it turns out empirically it's really, really hard to find those effects in terms of the dollar amounts that are there. There's a debate going on right now as to how big these effects are, but at least the concept is there for people to start thinking about. There is the seen part, and then there's the unseen part. In my world, in financial regulation, what we see from the Dodd-Frank Act, which basically told the regulators to go forth and promulgate 400 new rules, of which the SEC is responsible for about 100 of them. And it turns out the Dodd-Frank Act was passed a little over 4 years ago, and we're only about halfway done. So if you think about the biggest law change in the financial regulatory environment in the history of the United States, 4 years later, we're only about halfway done, which means we have half of them about to go, right? What are some of the seen effects? Well, we have things in there that limit the amount of risk-taking by banks, and we have things that require companies to hire a lot more compliance folks to work on to making sure they're complying with a lot of these regulations, right? And so some people point to the fact that they say, aha, if Dodd-Frank causes companies to hire more compliance workers, Dodd-Frank is actually a job creator, right? That's the seen effect. So you see companies that are hiring more compliance people on their staffs, right? And for those of you that are law students, you want to think about potentially compliance jobs in the future. That's a good effect, that's a positive effect, that's a seen effect, right? But what's the unseen effect? Well, the unseen effect is that that's money that they would have used to hire non-compliance people to actually grow the business and do other things as well. And so that is Bastiat's idea gives birth to that, right? And he talks about good economists and bad economists. And he says the good economist is the one who thinks about things like, well, potentially if you move forward with legislation or regulation that has a small negative effect at the beginning, potentially has a greater good yet to come, versus the bad economist only looks at those who follow the big part but don't think about the other stuff. And he talked about something called the broken window fallacy, right? Akin the lines of Dodd-Frank. And the fallacy goes like this. Suppose you have a factory owner who has a factory and he's got, a bunch of windows in the factory, and his child comes by one day and throws a rock and breaks the window, right? And you observe this, and the factory owner gets mad and he chastises the child, but the factory owner goes out and he finds a glass repairman to fix the glass. And it costs him, I think in his example, 6 francs, French francs, to do this. What is the seen part of, what do you see from the effect of this? You see that the glass repairman now is 6 francs richer than he otherwise would have been, right? And you say, all right, that's positive economic activity. And so some policymakers say, aha, in order to stimulate activity, why don't we go around bashing all the windows in town? And we can generate a lot of economic activity from this, right? But the fallacy of that argument is the unseen part. The unseen part is that the factory owner could have used those 6 French francs to buy something else, like perhaps get new shoes. And so now the cobbler it doesn't have as much money as he would have under this one. And so it's the seen effect and the unseen effect is what he's talking about. And this is something that I think in my mind in terms of intended, unintended consequences of any of the regulations that we promulgate. It's easy to see the seen effect. Better compliance, better investor protection, fewer fraud cases, all those types of things. What's the unseen effect? Well, potentially additional costs in terms of companies now are going to be able to use less money for productive uses. What are other potential costs, unseen effects? Well, what about effects on competition, right? If we do engage in regulation where there's a high fixed cost of regulation, so suppose there's some regulation where it's basically going to cost every firm the same amount and it's a high dollar amount, who benefits from that? The big firms or the small firms? The big ones, because it's a very small percentage of their business. Who does that competitively hurt? The small companies. And in fact, we have statutory requirements at the SEC to look at any time we promulgate a regulation to look at the effects on competition. And so when it comes time for us to think about regulating or adding additional burdens in the industry, we can think about what are ways in which we can make sure that it's not negatively affecting competition in these cases and negatively affecting small companies and entrenching the larger firms in the industry. I'll skip over that one slide. Frederick Hayek, Nobel Prize laureate, did a number of great things, but the one I want to point out for this lecture is he warned against the danger of what he termed scientism, which was sort of the false application of the scientific method or scientific principles to social sciences such as economics, right? And his point was that some economists at the time in the early 1900s and 1920s, 1930s were applying science in the social sciences and in law and in economics and other places that they otherwise should not be doing, right? There was among the intellectual elite, there was a number of folks that believed that if we could just apply scientific principles, we could apply things like linear programming and the precursors of computers, if we could just have a central government, a centrally planned economy where we have really, really smart people and they could collect enough information and we had good precursors to computers and stuff, we could control the economy in a way that would optimize things for everyone. But what he pointed out was that that doesn't work in highly complex systems like economies. It doesn't work, it's never going to be the case that a centrally planned economy is going to be better than one where you have risk-taking and folks with incentives to try to get capital to its most productive uses. Nobody is that smart. Nobody's going to have enough information to be able to do that, even in the age today of some of the supercomputers that we have. And so macroeconomists, right? So we have microeconomists and macroeconomists, right? I'm a microeconomist. We study how firms and individuals and organizations interact in markets and look at behaviors and those sorts of things. Macroeconomists look at overall impacts of things on the economy. So how things flow up, and they calculate things like the GDP, gross domestic product of a country, right? And the gross domestic product, one way to measure it is to add up, the amount of consumption, business investment, government spending, and net exports, right? C plus I plus G plus X minus M for those of you who have taken economics back in the day, right? And some macroeconomists are of the opinion where if you have a recession and you have less consumer spending, less business investment, if you want to juice up the economy, all you need to do, if it's C plus I plus G plus X minus M, all you need to do is increase G. Just increase government spending and you're good to go, right? And the problem with that is that there's all kinds of other interactions that you have from that. And you potentially have crowding out of business investment in the future and all kinds of other things, right? The other thing you have with macroeconomists measuring these numbers and stuff is this false sense of precision or the false sense of scientism that Hayek warned about, right? So how do you know that a macroeconomist have a sense of humor? They use decimal points, right? So when they say the economy is going to grow, they don't say about 3% or about 4%. They say 3.5%, right? Now, is there a real sense of precision to that? And then it always gets revised back upwards or backwards or whatever else it is, right? And there's this notion that macroeconomists can predict all these things very, very well, and they use all these decimal points and stuff. And so, are they really that accurate? Well, there was just an op-ed piece in the Wall Street Journal last week, right? This is from Eddie Lazier. He was my boss when I worked at the Council of Economic Advisors. One of my jobs was I was a senior economist at the Council of Economic Advisors for the last 6 months of the Bush administration and the first 6 months of the Obama administration. And the chair of the Council of Economic Advisors at the time was Eddie Lazier. He's a finance professor. He went back to Stanford. And he talked about the fact that we spent a heck of a lot of time. We had macroeconomic forecasters at the Council of Economic Advisors, the Federal Reserve, the Treasury, the Office of Management and Budget. They spend a lot of time doing all these forecasts about what the economy is going to do. They put in nice little decimal points in there, and they do all this stuff. And his point was they receive a lot of attention. Not only do they receive a lot of attention, but we have something called the Congressional Budget Office, the CBO, which does projections in terms of the economy, and that's how legislation on the Congress gets scored in terms of the effect on the economy, whether it's going to have positive effects or negative effects. And this scorecard that CBO gives, whether it's going to be net increase or decrease in terms of the deficit and the budget, those are very, very important in terms of whether something actually can pass legislation or not, right? But it turns out we're not very good at this sort of stuff. What his point kind of is in the realm of we're being a lot more scientific, we're thinking we're being a lot more scientific, but it turns out we just sort of guessed with a Ouija board, or if you just, in this case, the title's more sort of, hyperbolic than the actual article in there. But basically what he says is if you just used a very simple rule of thumb and said the economy is going to grow on average at 3%, you'd actually do better in terms of forecasting going forward than if you actually tried to forecast this thing as a little more than 3% or a little less than 3%. If you just throw out 3%, you're probably pretty close on this one. And so maybe we're spending a lot more time in the interest in following this sort of this scientism sort of concept when really we aren't that good at that sort of thing, right? George Stigler, he developed something. He developed the theory of regulatory capture, which I think about a lot of times. And his point in the theory of regulatory capture is that oftentimes a regulatory agency is set up to regulate a particular industry to keep them, to make sure that they don't have undue influence, and then make sure that they're sort of serving the public interest and those sorts of things. But over time, what can happen is that the industry can actually capture the regulator. And so the regulator, even unknowingly, is actually doing things to help out the industry rather than actually regulating them, right? So thinking about things like, if we don't take into account the competitive effects of regulation, we can actually be helping in the entrenched firms within the industry, right? Not only are they going to have to pay a little bit, but also the smaller guys pay more, so that actually creates a barrier to entry to the smaller firms, right? He went even beyond that and went one step further and said, so people have been thinking about regulation sort of in the economic sphere, what the supply of regulation, like where does regulation come from, what precipitates it, all that. And he actually came up with the radical notion that some firms in the industry actually demand regulation and actually want more of it. Who wants it? A lot of times it's the big guys. Why? Because they want to create barriers to entry. There are no libertarians on Wall Street, right? They want more regulation. They love it. It actually helps them keep out the small guys. And what I need to do as a regulator is to think about this and say, wait a minute, some people say, oh, okay, we got this regulation and these, it has these potential benefit effects, and it's okay with, the firms in the industry. Well, that actually makes me worry, because if it's okay with the big guys, perhaps they're the ones maybe behind it on this sort of thing, right? And so he said, regulation may actively be sought by an industry. And this was a radical theory back in the day, right? Back then, the notion was, and some people still have, this notion that there's these benevolent regulators. People like me were born on a special farm somewhere, and we think about the public interest, and we don't have any biases, and we don't have any political views of the world or whatever it is, right? No, we're just regular people who happen to have this particular job. We're no different than anyone else. We come in with all our political biases. We come in with all kinds of other biases as well, too. And economists who were looking at behaviors of, say, managers within a corporation and looking at the agency problems that how do shareholders align interests, align managers' interests with their own to make sure managers don't steal money from the firm and take money from the shareholders, right? Applying that same type of thinking to government, whether it's in the legislature or whether it's in a regulatory agency, and thinking about the dynamics here, right? Thinking about regulation as a market, the market for regulation. Very sort of, what are you talking about here? Well, there's prices for this. There's demand for regulation, and there's a supply of regulation, and how are the influencing activities and the incentives and all that sort of thing. Very radical thinking. He won the Nobel Prize for this. For those of you that have been following what's going on with the New York Fed recently, this is one where there was a woman who worked at the Federal Reserve Bank of New York who taped conversations with people that are working there. And if you listen to these conversations, it sounds a heck of a lot like they're not very tough on some of the big banks that they're supposed to be regulating in this case. This American Life on NPR, on NPR, right, has some of her stuff. Like 2 weeks ago on this thing, right? And it was great because people were like shocked that the regulators could be captured by the industry, right? And the Wall Street Journal, I think like a week later, or maybe a week ago, did this editorial. It's like basically public meet George Stigler. Like he talked about this sort of thing. This is not a surprise that people have in these things. This is something that I, as a regulator, I am conscious of every single day, and I worry about, am I being captured by the industry, either knowingly or unknowingly, from these particular things. Right? There's this professor who's, I didn't put the years up there because he's actually still alive, Bruce Yandel at Clemson University. And he came up with this great, this great theory. It's called bootleggers and Baptists, right? And what he was actually a regulator himself, and he was trying to think about what types of regulation sort of, one, gets done, and two, sort of stands the test of time. And what he found was that regulation that stands the test of time, there tends to be this coalition of what he called Baptists and bootleggers. And he got the idea from Prohibition, right? So if you think back to in the United States, we had Prohibition for a while, right? And who was the public face of Prohibition, getting rid of drinking alcohol in the United States? The public face were the Baptists, the people who have the moral cause. These are the people that have an ethical cause. We have a lot of do-gooders who want to do good ethical things and are proposing stuff. But who are the people in the shadows that are benefiting from this? Well, it turns out the biggest people who benefited from Prohibition were the bootleggers, the people who were illegally making alcohol, right? Because now they no longer had competition from the people who were legally making this, right? They were happy to let the bootleggers, the Baptists be the face of this sort of thing. And they were sort of, hiding back in the shadows, right? Now, this is very relevant to us for a couple reasons. First of all, does anyone know who was the first chairman of the Securities and Exchange Commission, SEC? I'm just going to drink of water here for a second. What's that? Joseph Kennedy. He wasn't a Baptist. He was a bootlegger. Right? Now, it's probably an urban legend, but supposedly FDR, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, said it takes a crook to catch a crook. But I don't know whether that's true or not. But right? He was a bootlegger who benefited tremendously from Prohibition. Why? Because he had no competition from the from people legally making this sort of stuff. Right? I think about this all the time because we get, at the SEC, we have a number of folks that come in and want us to engage in certain regulations, require companies to make certain disclosures, whether they're using green energy or whether they're doing other sorts of things. And I wonder about who are the bootleggers behind the scenes that are going to actually benefit from these sorts of things. Okay. And the next one. Inconvenient results, right? So economists sometimes do studies that go against sort of conventional wisdom, right? Many of you familiar with sort of the Freakonomics guys? Stephen Dubner and Stephen Levitt, right? They've done a number of things where they just do look at a bunch of studies. They look at a bunch of things, and they sometimes turn conventional wisdom on its head. One of my favorite examples is the one where they looked at data regarding highway fatalities and whether or not the fact that laws mandating child seats actually have decreased traffic deaths related to children. And what they did was they actually crunched the numbers very, very, very carefully. And what they found was that child car seats may not be any more effective than proper seatbelt use, right? How do they find this? What do? They just looked at a bunch of data and they looked at this stuff. What they find is that most of the benefit in terms of traffic fatalities among children are attributed to one simple thing: moving them from the front seat to the back seat, right? Moving from the death seat, the passenger seat that's in the front, to the back seat, right? Now, if you put them in the back seat with an adult seatbelt, they don't fit properly in some cases and can actually strangle the child. Their point on this, and then they looked at what were the marginal benefits from child car seats, right? And for those of you with children, right, these things are impossible to put in your car, right? And it turns out that 80% of people, or some huge percentage of people, don't even install them properly anyway, right? And so it turns out if you just had properly fitting seatbelts where you could actually bring down the seatbelt for the children, right, it would actually just have as much of a benefit. Well, who cares, right? Well, the car seat manufacturers care, right? Because they're making money with it. These things can cost like $200 or something, right? And you can't buy the cheap one from Walmart because, right, you're not a good parent if you do that, right? Or maybe, right, you got to buy the expensive one, right? Well, right, again, who cares, right? Well, it turns out that maybe we could have gotten the same amount of benefits for a much, much lower cost overall from this. Maybe it costs $20 for the car seat manufacturers to do an adjustable seat belt for this, right? All right, no harm, no foul. Well, but what are the distributional effects? Who's affected more by this sort of thing, right? People with high income, high net worth people, not such a big deal. Low income, low net worth people, these mandatory child car seat laws maybe are more of a burden on them and those sorts of things. Very, very inconvenient results they come up with. Economists thinking a little bit different way, but thinking differently, but in a good way. And it turned out one of my favorite parts of this is who were the people who were most critical of their results? It was the people who were the so-called safety advocates, because they were the ones all along saying that we need the car seats, we need the car seats, we need the car seats, all this other sort of stuff. But you got some economists to come in and say, maybe that's not the case, right? That often happens to us where some economist writes an idea, or I talk to folks, and I get attacked by investor advocates or consumer advocates. How dare you say this? We need to have these additional regulations to protect consumers and stuff. And I said, well, where's your evidence? And they're, what? Well, we just know it to be true, right? There's people that, what I say, tend to have religion on certain things. But if you look at the data, you look at the evidence on this stuff, maybe that's not the case. And so you get the advocates of child safety or investor protection stuff sometimes will come after you on some of these things. One of the more tragic things that we have to deal with at the SEC has to do with a provision in Dodd-Frank. As I mentioned, Dodd-Frank was the Dodd-Frank Act, named after Senator Chris Dodd and Congressman Barney Frank, was passed in 2010. And the headline is it's meant to deal with gaps and weaknesses attributable to the regulatory environment, the financial regulatory environment that led to the financial crisis. And there are a number of provisions in there that do such a thing. Now, the problem when legislation gets done on the Hill is that legislation doesn't get done very often. And so when it gets done, it's a vehicle to attach other things to it in order to get votes on this stuff, right? And the way Dodd-Frank was done was that the House had passed a regulatory reform bill, the House of Representatives, and then the Senate passed a regulatory reform bill, right? So the Barney Frank-led one, the Chris Dodd one, and they don't match, right? For those of you the law students, or for those of you that used to watch the Saturday morning thing, I'm just a bill, just a plain old bill sitting here on Capitol Hill, right? You need to reconcile these two together, right? There's a couple ways you can do it. You can do, the House could have just adopted what the Senate passed and been done with it. You can do what's called ping pong, where the House takes some of the Senate stuff and not all of it, and they send it back, they pass that, send it back to the Senate takes it, and you go back and forth. Or you can do something called a conference committee, where each of the majority and minority leaders from each of the House and the Senate elect people to become part of a conference committee, and the conference committee reconciles a bill, and a bill pops out on the other end. And that's exactly what happened in Dodd-Frank. Now, the problem when you go into a conference committee, you go back and forth on some of the provisions that are in there or whatever. The problem is, the problem that happened in Dodd-Frank was that literally the last night of the conference committee, right? Up until then, there were I think 14 titles of Dodd-Frank plus like an odd tax one that was in there, right? The night that it goes through, here's a vehicle that's going to go through, and there's some bad ideas that are sitting out there, right? Some do-gooders, some Baptists that want to get some good ideas through here and actually, help with, to try to help save the world and that sort of stuff. Let's use the SEC's disclosure regime as a way to try to help solve the world. There were a bunch of provisions that got thrown into the section 1500, so it was in Title 15, which in Dodd-Frank, if you look at the law, it says miscellaneous provisions, because they couldn't think of a title for this thing, because they literally threw it in at the last moment. One of the provisions in there is one that some folks wanted, that has been out, it's a bad idea that's been out there for years. What it did was required the commission, the SEC, to issue rules that require companies to disclose whether or not any of the products that they made contained what were called conflict minerals, right? And conflict minerals were designed as minerals that came from conflict regions, which is effectively the Democratic Republic of the Congo, right? So what was happening in the DRC at the time was that there were warlords that were fighting each other, a lot of tribal warfare that was going on. And there was a lot of awful stuff, killing and raping and pillaging, all this sort of stuff that was bad stuff. Some of these warlords were using the proceeds from minerals that were mined in those mines to finance the war and do a bunch of bad things. So a bunch of do-gooders said, well, wait a minute, how can we help to stop this? What if we shame companies from even dealing with these warlords, and they won't have to, and then companies, and then we can try to stop all this bad stuff from happening, right? And so there's a provision in there that requires companies to disclose whether or not they're using conflict minerals, right? Now, forget about the cost to the company. Well, let's think about the cost to the company, right? If you manufacture, say, an iPhone or a BlackBerry, you now have to certify that everywhere along the supply chain does not come from a conflict region. It's virtually impossible, particularly because a lot of these minerals come from different places, go into a smelter, get mixed together. You have no idea sort of where this comes from. And there's actually some First Amendment questions that the courts are dealing with now in terms of this provision in our rule that comes forward from this. But the tragic part of this is something that economists easily, we said, we know what's going to happen here. It's going to have a lot of really, really bad effects. And I just chose one professor because he happens to have a blog post on this and was one of the ones that I saw that was out there. He said, look, the law is going to reduce the demand for conflict minerals, thus lowering their price and probably the revenue from the conflict country suppliers, mostly affecting minerals from the Congo. It raises demand from other sources, from other ones, thus raising the cost for American companies to do business legitimately, right? And so it's going to raise costs for U.S. consumers. It's going to lower the prices in the Democratic Republic of the Congo or anywhere nearby from there, right? And people are in those places, the legitimate type of businesses are actually going to suffer as well as some of these warlords who are doing all these bad things, right? Turned out it was even worse than that because it lowered the price so much. Here's somebody who was actually on the ground in the DRC. What companies said was that, look, we're just not even going to deal with anybody close to this region. And so what was happening was legitimate mines in the Democratic Republic of the Congo were actually closing up. Schools were closing, people were unemployed, hospitals were closing, and it's having tragic, tragic results on the ground in the DRC, right? And and by the way, right, so no company wants to be tarred with financing warlords or saying that they're dealing in conflict minerals. So they're just buying stuff elsewhere, right? It's for locals, the law has been a catastrophe. The schools were closing, hospitals are closing, a lot of sort of tragic results there, right? And then after that happened, the economists, the other thing that's happening is the warlords are still finding ways to sell the money on the black market somewhere else anyway. So it's not having the intended effect, right? And after that came out in the New York Times, this economist first noticed it said, look, a number of months ago, I noted a simple point here. This was going to create a surplus. It's going to benefit buyers. It's going to not help U.S. People at all. And he said, I shouldn't brag. Any Econ 1 student could have seen this point. It's depressing to see it come through, right? Here is just a simple thing that economists saw was going to happen on this stuff, and it still got passed because people said, we need to do something, right? And so, again, we think differently, but in a good way. Hopefully, if people start listening to us a little more, we start acting less like Spock. We start acting less with putting a bunch of numbers and graphs and stuff on there and start talking and using plain English and stuff that people can understand that economists have a number of things that I think that we can add to the debate. And I think that's exactly what I try to do at the Commission, being only the third PhD economist in the history of the Commission. I think a little bit differently than the lawyers that are there and try to add that, right? So I'll end there. I'll end on a happier note than the sort of the tragic conflict minerals thing, and then open it up to questions for anybody who wants to ask me questions, right? So there are three types of people in the world: optimists, pessimists, and economists, right? Optimists see that glass is half full. Pessimists see the glass is half empty. Economists see a glass that's twice as big as it needs to be, right? Again, we just think a little bit differently, but in a good way. So hopefully you take that from this conversation. I'm happy to engage in any type of conversation about either what I talked to you about, what we're doing at the SEC, if I was a tree, what kind of tree I would be, or those types of things. So I'll end there, and thank you all very much. Any questions? Yes, Steve.
Commissioner, I've been chatting with Professor Douglas often about a thought that I had, and it kind of ties to what you talked about. You've got the, when you have regulation, for example, on accredited investors, you've got the obvious result. Then you've got the unforeseen result that might, or the hidden result that might affect competition and whatnot. But it struck me that you have a second tier unforeseen or hidden result that really has to do with wealth distribution. You've seen, or at least I've seen articles about how the bank bailout has led to increase in wealth distribution at the upper end as opposed to the middle end. And maybe that was a good thing, maybe it was a bad thing. I'm not making you value judgment.
Oh, I am. Bank bailouts were a horrible thing. Okay.
I don't disagree, but I
okay.
didn't want to.
Right.
But something that I was struck by is more and more, in the name of protecting the consumer,
Yeah.
individuals are being denied the opportunity to invest. And so there are all these investment opportunities out there that none of these students, I'm going to guess in the room, even after they graduate and are practicing as attorneys, they will not be accredited investors, at least not in their first, second, or third year.
Right.
Many of us may not be accredited investors. Many SEC employees may not qualify as
Right.
accredited investors.
Right. Many SEC commissioners are not.
And many SEC commissioners. And so
Right.
you are, not you individually, but the commission.
Right.
Its rules and regulations
Right.
to protect the consumer
Right.
are indirectly allowing a certain segment of the population access to investment opportunities that everyone else does not have.
Right.
And so as you look at the cost-benefit analysis,
Right.
not only of the direct, but of the unforeseen consequences of
Right.
competition, how do you factor in, if at all, the deeper societal unforeseen results?
Yeah, no, excellent question, excellent, and it's very timely, right? So, for those of you not familiar, the accredited investor definition at the SEC is basically a function of two things: either your net income or your wealth, right? So, to your point about sort of those at the upper level and those type of thing, right? And the question is, right, well, if you're not in there, why shouldn't you have access to these other alternative investments, right? So one way to, and people say, well, because they're riskier, right? But, as a financial economist, I think of, well, the risk, what we learn in modern portfolio theory is that it's not the risk of an investment in isolation, but I already have a portfolio of securities. If I can add an alternative investment that has a certain expected return and yet is uncorrelated with stuff that I have in here, even if it's risky individually, if I can add it to my portfolio, if you go through and you do the portfolio math on this, right, it's not only a function of the expected return and the variances of both of those, but the covariance between the two. I can find something that's uncorrelated. I can actually find something that's risk reducing for my portfolio. And we're shutting out that particular part of the market. There is legislation on the Hill that would address that issue. There's legislation that's already passed that kind of does, but the one that most directly does is Congressman McCarthy has a bill that would change how we define accredited investors. In addition, we have something at the Commission called the Investor Advisory Committee, where it was created by Dodd-Frank, and each of the commissioners gets to appoint 4 people on this committee for, I think it's 4 or 5-year terms. And they meet periodically every few months and weigh in on particular issues as kind of like a way for us to deal with these issues. And they just last week came forward with a recommendation to open up the investor, the definition of accredited investor, to include other things like, suppose we could include automatically anyone with a CFA designation or a CPA designation, or thinking outside the box, is there some sort of test that you could do? But then there's questions about like who would administer the exam and all that sort of stuff, right? And so that's an active question that's going on right now. At the same time, they said, well, perhaps we should increase the income or net worth things as well too. So giving on one hand, taking away from the other, right? Other people have expressed concerns that it's based on either net worth or income. And the net worth, actually Dodd-Frank, or actually the SEC went through and changed. It used to be you could include your house in your net worth. We've taken that out. So there's a higher, it creates a higher standard there. There's some concerns in there about seniors who have no income but a high net worth. Are they accredited? Do we want them to lose money? All those sorts of things. And those are debates that we're having right now, right? Another thing that sort of indirectly sort of addresses that issue is that there's something called the Jobs Act, the Jumpstart Our Business Startup Act, which was one of the few pieces of bipartisan legislation that was passed in 2012 that requires the SEC to engage in a number of rulemakings to increase the availability of access to capital by corporations, right? So part of our mission is investor protection, part of it's fairly and efficient markets, and the other is facilitating capital formation, right? If we don't have companies that issue, we can invest, if we want to get rid of all fraud, we can just, say nobody can invest in anything, right? It's the only way to get rid of all fraud, right? But then companies wouldn't have access to capital, right? And there's a number of provisions. One of the provisions in there is something called crowdfunding, right? Where typically, when accredited investors, before the Jobs Act, right? If you weren't accredited, you could only invest in public SEC registrant companies, right? And how do we protect investors? We do it through our disclosure regime, right? When a company goes public, the underwriters have certain due diligence requirements, and then the companies have to have a prospectus. Then there's ongoing disclosure requirements like the annual reports, the quarterly reports, and all that sort of stuff, right? If you're in the private securities realm before you go public, that's where that was basically only accredited investors could get into that space and deal with and invest in companies after they've received venture cap financing or maybe some private equity financing or that sort of stuff, and you could get into that space, right? Congress passed something called the crowdfunding provision, which allows retail investors, non-accredited investors, to invest in the earliest stage companies even before venture cap financing and private equity financing, right? And what they noted was that the SEC's normal sort of investor protection disclosure regime doesn't work. The economics just aren't there, right? If you have, Sally's cupcake shop, right? She's not going to hire an underwriter to do due diligence. She's not going to have 3 years of audited financial statements, all those types of things, right? And so how can we allow those companies to have access to capital while still protecting investors? The disclosure regime simply doesn't work. So what Congress did there was they said, all right, we're going to use a net income and an aggregate gross annual gross income and a net worth test, right? But we're not going to shut everybody out. What we're going to do is limit the amount that you can invest, and therefore the amount that you can lose from an investor protection perspective on a sliding scale that's based on adjusted gross income and net worth. So that's one potential way to think about it. Rather than it being an on-off switch so that you're completely shut out, Congress has said, well, why don't we think about a sliding scale, and it's a percentage based upon either one of those. Now, it turns out that the legislation is ambiguous in terms of whether it's the greater of the two or the lesser of the two. And so at the commission level, we're sort of arguing over which one of those that is. And it's actually proving, we've got the rule out for proposal right now. So the way it works is we put a rule out for proposal, the public comments on it, and then we adjust from that and then can go either have to repropose or can go final on it. It's out for proposal. We've gotten thousands and thousands of comment letters from people passionate on both sides. We've got the traditional consumer investor advocates who say, protection advocates who say, this is going to be rife with fraud, you shouldn't do it, go very, very carefully. You got the Silicon Valley types who say, don't worry about it. Congress had set up these internet portals. We're going to have like an eBay. People buy and sell junk on the internet and send people money all the time. You develop, you don't have to worry about it. We're going to solve all these problems. We're thinking through those issues right now. So there's a number of ways that people are sort of thinking about this issue. And so it's one that's out there right now. We would welcome comment on the accredited investor definition. People can think very creatively about how we can expand that. I'd be all ears to hear that. Yes. Thanks. Mm-hmm.
I know that Dodd-Frank actually, at least Dodd-Frank, asked the commission to reevaluate the accredited investment
Right.
every so often.
Right.
That time has come and gone.
Right.
But I know you mentioned a couple of different ways that the commission is considering altering it. Is there a plan to alter or adjust the legislation? And I understand
Yep.
it has been
Right.
since it was promulgated in 1980.
No, that's right. It's a very good point. One of the things I forgot was that it was the numbers that are in there, right? But some people are saying, well, the numbers are too low because it's not adjusted for inflation. Other people are saying, well, we should open this up and do that. And so the commission has, I think we have to do it, is it every 2 years we have to look at it? every 4, whatever it is, right? We have to look at it and decided not to adjust it, right? So the plan right now is we have no plan. No, the plan right now is we pretend we have a plan when we don't have a plan. The plan is to, at least I've seen no impetus in actually moving it up, at all, but at least considering what the Investor Advisory Committee said, what legislation is potentially coming on the Hill that would require us to do various things, potentially opening up on different types of. So Dodd-Frank was focused just on the test, right? Let's think more broadly here on these particular issues. And we're just thinking through those issues right now. Those, yeah. Yep.
Real estate and that people were issuing mortgages to probably kids. But there was another aspect that you're not talking about, the derivatives, the sale of the swaps, 10 times the size of Lehman Brothers, the banks were selling. Obviously, substantial risk involved
Right.
in selling all of that.
Right.
And that was why they had to be bailed out. And the banks then used this money to pay bonuses. The idea was to generate more loans, but they included pay bonuses. And the talk is when you find the banks, they're going to continue to go and do risky endeavors. Somebody has to go to jail to stop doing this. Nobody's been charged.
Yeah.
Has there been any thought that
Oh.
people actually, legal things when
Yeah.
they created all this risk?
Yeah, I mean, there's one of the things that a lot of people find unsatisfying from what happened after the crisis was that nobody went to jail, right? So first of all, the SEC, we can't put people in jail. We only have civil authority. We can turn things over to the Department of Justice, and often do, and they're the ones that can actually put people in jail, right? So, for example, Martha Stewart did not go to jail for insider trading. She went to jail for lying to the SEC about insider trading, right? And so there are people that can do those sorts of things, right? One of the things, and so I wasn't at the commission on a number of those things, right? Unfortunately, since 2007, 2008, we're up to the statute of limitations on certain things stemming from the crisis. So at this point, some things can't actually go through. One of the things I do as a commissioner is often think about sort of individual culpability on particular things, right? When the staff makes recommendations to me in terms of whether or not we're going to charge individuals or whether or not we're just going to assess a penalty, on the corporation. And some people believe that if you do these very, very large penalties on corporations, then that'll deter future behavior, right? The alternative way of thinking is that, well, wait a minute, who pays those penalties? Is it management or is it the shareholders? Oftentimes, shareholders are the victims of the management, right, doing fraudulent things like fraudulent accounting or those types of things, right? And when that gets revealed to the market, what happens to the share price? The share price goes down. Who got punished? The shareholders. Then you have regulatory agencies or the Department of Justice come in and don't go after individuals, but then go after big fines after the companies. Who pays that again? The shareholders, right? And so in my mind, as an economist thinking through this stuff, is this the right way of sort of thinking about these particular things, right? The difficult part is they're highly, highly complex, right? There was a huge number of factors that contributed to the financial crisis, right? And kind of everybody has their own narrative as to what it is, right? Derivatives obviously played some sort of role on this. And one of the things that came out of Dodd-Frank was that Title VII of Dodd-Frank, actually before Dodd-Frank, the SEC, the regulators were prohibited from regulating this market. It was actually in law, right? And it turns out right now it's a $700 trillion notional value market. It's really, really important to have regulatory transparency in this market. Dodd-Frank allowed us to do that. That's one of my, the things that that I think is a good thing of Dodd-Frank. It allows at least regulatory transparency into this market so that we know how much leverage these banks really have, whether or not they're using these derivative instruments for mitigating risks or taking on risks, right? Because you can use it sort of either way, right? Everybody kind of has their narratives. There was an over-reliance on credit ratings, right? Is it the credit rating agency's fault for being wrong, or was it the fact that people were just over-reliant on them, right? I happen to be in the second. Wait, somebody work for the credit rating agencies, or?
No, I'm an auditing professor.
Oh, there you go. Oh, there you go. Very sort of, right? And so there was we know there was an over-reliance on credit ratings, right? And why is that the case? And so we can kind of think through all the issues on there, right? There's a number of things that created the financial crisis, right? And there's a professor, Andy Lowe, finance professor, financial economics professor at MIT, who has this paper, this essay where he went through and he read, I think it was something like 21 different books on what caused the financial crisis. And it turns out that there's like 21 different narratives. I forget what the number is. It's something like that, right? And he uses the analogy of what's called the Rashomon effect, right? There's this movie by this Japanese filmmaker called Kurosawa called Rashomon, where there was a murder, and there were like 6 different witnesses to the murder, and they all kind of see like different pieces of it, and they all kind of have different versions of the truth on this stuff, right? And so it may be the case that there was no criminal activity, right? And maybe it's the right outcome that there's no people should be in jail. It may be the case that there was some criminal activity and some people should be in jail, and it's unfortunately it's past that time, right? The unfortunate part about what happened on Capitol Hill was that unlike what happened during the Great Depression, right? So when you had the stock market crash and there was a lot of abuses on Wall Street, what did Congress do? Well, they took their time and set up something called the Pecora Commission, which is named after the chief counsel of the Senate Banking Committee. And the Pecora Commission did a multi-year study as to what were the abuses that were happening on Wall Street. What came out of that? Well, you have the Securities Act of 1933, the Securities Exchange Act of 1934, the Banking Act of 1935. You have the Investment Company Act of 1940, the Investment Company Act of 1940, and some other banking ones that came along the way. And you had a very thoughtful process where you have very targeted legislation that looked at very, very specific things. And the Securities Exchange Act of 1934 actually created the SEC. And created other things, created other regulatory agencies. And Ferdinand Pecora became one of the original commissioners of the FCC. And you look at that. What happened during Dodd-Frank? Well, in the immediate aftermath of the crisis, what happened after the crisis, we have Dodd-Frank was passed, and Congress didn't do the equivalent of the Pecora Commission. Congress punted to something called the Financial Crisis Inquiry Commission, which did their report in December of 2010, but Dodd-Frank was already passed in July of 2010. So it was shoot first, aim later, or try to, right? And so what happens is, I don't think that we've done a full accounting, at least in terms of doing the work, in terms of thinking what really caused the crisis and what are the things that really, really need to get addressed, rather than thinking about through some of the other things, so. Yeah.
About your perspective as a consumer.
Right.
You deal with a lot of lawyers. I'm curious about what you observe about the legal mind and in terms of what qualities do you like to see in lawyers? What do you think makes them particularly effective? Or do you think there are certain skills? I mean, if you were to change legal education in some way, what might you do?
That's very good. And I love lawyers. In fact, I brought one with me. So Adam Glazer, one of my counsels, is here with me as well too, right? So I have, as a non-chair commissioner, so there's 5 commissioners at the SEC. One is the chair and sort of the chief administrative officer of the commission and is in charge of all the whole staff stuff. The other 4 of us basically have an office of, we have an assistant, and then we have 4 counsel positions. And you don't have to hire lawyers. You can hire some lawyer, commissioners of hire economists or accountants or that sort of stuff, right? I've hired all 4 lawyers because I need the legal help on these issues. Adam's my expert in the Investment Company Investor Advisor Act of 1940s. I got one that deals with the Securities Act, 1933 Act, Division of Corporation Finance issues, and I have 2 on the Trading and Market side, the 34 Act, just because we have so many rules coming down the pipeline on that, right? In terms of things that I appreciate with them, one is just knowledge of the law, right? So that's one, right? Because I oftentimes, right, there's all these fancy words like misappropriating, right, that I translate to stealing, right? So basically, we have all these like fancy sort of, legal sort of stuff. And basically for me, securities law violations always come down to lying, cheating, or stealing, okay? So what's going on here? Lying, cheating, or stealing, right? And helping me think about where the boundaries of the law are, right? And there's a number of court cases out there that sort of set precedents in this area. And so my counsel, I rely on them for that advice. I deal with lawyers in the rulemaking divisions. And one of the things that I value with them is understanding what is the statutory requirements that Congress tells us what we want to do, right? And there may be some discretionary choices into how we carry that out, and in, and working with the economists in terms of what are the costs and benefits from the alternatives that are there, thinking through effects of competition, efficiency, capital formation, all that sort of stuff. My engagement with the enforcement attorneys, right? So like Lisa or Eric Bustillo, oftentimes I'm reading action memos where they're preparing recommendations to either move forward with suing somebody in court, going after securities law violations, or settling with somebody, and then that thinking through all the legal theories that are in there and explaining those in terms of why they're coming up with charging individuals or not charging individuals, or charging something short of fraud or charging something fraud, and so explaining that sort of stuff. And I guess the single biggest skill that I value is good writing skills. If somebody can explain something in sort of plain English, whether it's in an action memorandum that I'm reading on an enforcement recommendation, or in a rule proposal so that the public can comment on that, or in terms of thinking through what are good disclosures that would make sense, that are not legalistic, those types of things, or whether it's one of my counsels helping me to write a speech that I'm going to give. I think knowledge of the law would be one. I think writing skills, I think, would be number two. Number three would be being risk averse as a lawyer, right? So oftentimes your client wants to do dumb things, right? And so for my four counsels, I'm the client, and I often want to do a lot of dumb things, and they say, no, you probably shouldn't do that sort of thing. You probably shouldn't say that or do this sort of thing or whatever it is. I think that is that's a valuable skill as well too. And then also just, being well-rounded in terms of not only just knowing the law and things, but also historically and how this fits in with other sorts of things. Being able to connect the dots on various issues as well too, I think are sort of good skills. Hopefully those are things that you're teaching and doing those sorts of things. When the dean was talking here about the importance of diversity, and I know that we and Lisa we were talking about that there's a large Hispanic population that attends here at FIU as well too. I think language skills, non-English skills, are becoming more and more increasingly important, particularly in the securities thing. As we see more and more securities violations are global in nature. And so we have somebody who's engaging in a pump and dump scheme, who's located in Canada, perpetrating the fraud in the United States, and putting the money in a bank in Panama. Right? And so being able to engage with regulators from other jurisdictions that may not have English as a first language is very, very important. We also had recently a breakthrough with the Chinese Securities Regulatory Commission, where we were for the first time able to get audit work papers from a Chinese auditor, which has been very, very difficult for a long time. There's these state secrets laws that were very, very difficult. We were able to get them, right? But be careful what you wish for, because now we have like 200,000 pages of audit work papers in Mandarin Chinese, right? We need people with those language skills to be able to read those. Those are going to become increasingly important the more and more we're engaging with foreign regulators in foreign jurisdictions involving international fraud. So that would be another one as well too. So if you could be a superhuman and have all those skills, then you can be a good lawyer. So good. And a sense of humor, or at least laugh at my jokes. I mean, or pretend to have a sense of humor. No, it's good. Good.
From an enforcement side, so just a question more on the rulemaking side, how do you go about trying to figure out, what unintended consequences may come from something, because we're talking about complex organizations, and you're trying to look prospectively, obviously a lot of times it's easier to see in hindsight.
Right.
So obviously you should have seen it, but
right.
How do you go about trying to do that?
Sure. So, we sometimes think that we know what the unintended consequences are going to be, right? And I gave the example, sort of the conflict minerals one, where economists it was kind of an easy one. It was actually worse than we sort of thought. In some cases, it's fairly easy. You can see it. In some cases, it's more complex. So what do you do? Well, what I like to do is, let's look at international evidence, right? If we're thinking about doing something, what have other countries gone through and done the same thing? What were the effects there? And maybe we can learn from them, right? The Ontario Securities Commission, the Canadian, so the Canadian has provincial securities commissions, but the Ontario one is the big one. A large part of what their regulatory agenda is following what we do. which from an economist perspective is probably the efficient way to do it. And so what they typically do is watch what we do, look at the intended, unintended effects, and adopt something similar that may be either, that may be better, or look at the, wait for us to go first and do that. So you kind of look at the international evidence is another one too. And then a third way is to say, all right, maybe we think we know what the intended effects are, but we're not sure exactly what they're going to be. And so why don't we build into the rule the idea that we're going to do a retrospective review in 5 years or 3 years or however long it is to look and see, do we need to make changes? Did we have unintended consequences we didn't think about ahead of time, right? And so what you can build into the rule is say, all right, how are we going to measure success? What are the metrics we need in order to do that? And then build in data requirements in terms of reporting requirements from the firms that are affected by this, so that in 2 years or 3 years or 5 years' time, we have the data to go back and look at, were we right about the unintended consequences? Do we need to go back and redo these sorts of things? Another way we can do it is engage in a pilot study, a pilot program, where we say, look, we think we know what's going to happen, we're not sure, but is there a natural experiment that we could do where we say, look, we're going to do this temporarily for 6 months, a year, 2 years, whatever it is, study the effects, and then decide whether to make it permanent. And we're engaged right now in one, what's called the tick size pilot program. We just put that out for public comment, or we're going to be doing it very soon, where the concern here is that the equity markets don't seem to be serving small cap companies very well. And some people have suggested that the tick size, the minimum trading increment, this is an in the weeds thing for market microstructure people, is maybe too small. So let's think about increasing the tick size on this. But that could potentially harm investors, pay on average maybe higher in costs for these sorts of things. We're not sure which way it's going to go. So we're going to do a pilot study where we're going to take a certain set of firms where we're going to apply the tick the wider tick size and do some things with that, and then a control sample and actually study the effects. We did a similar thing on short sale price restrictions, the bid test and the uptick test a while back, and can study the heck out of it. So there's sort of different ways we can sort of think about those things. And then the other one is the public comment process. We say, well, we think it's going to cost this much for systems changes. Public, tell us your best estimate on the cost, and we solicit public impact as well too. So there's a number of ways that we can sort of do this sort of thing. Question. Yes?
When the unintended consequences are worse than
Right.
we didn't, like in the mineral conflict account,
Right.
how much discretion does the administrative agency have in saying, we don't want to enforce this anymore, or is it up to Congress to roll it back?
Excellent question, right? So it depends, right? So economists, like lawyers, can answer every question with "it depends," right? And it depends on what, right? So if it's discretionary rulemaking where Congress doesn't tell us to do it and we're just doing it, right? We need to do, we're required by something called the Administrative Procedure Act, for those of you that are versed in this sort of thing, to engage in certain procedural things that we need to do. Notice and comment to the public, those sorts of issues. And part of that is that in addition to that, we have requirements to look at the effects on competition, efficiency, capital formation, and we have to do what's called cost-benefit analysis, and sort of lay out what are the benefits and what are the costs. And if it's discretionary rulemaking, we better be able to justify that the benefits outweigh the costs. And if it turns out it's not the case, then Congress can tell us, or people can actually sue us in court to say we haven't done this properly, right? But what if it's a mandated rule, like the conflict minerals disclosure, right? The problem with the Administrative Procedure Act is it doesn't apply to Congress. Congress can pass a law, they don't have to do any cost-benefit analysis. And so the net effects can be negative no matter what you do, right? Now, if they tell us to pass a law that is going to have sort of negative effects, right? One of the things that we have to do is think of, well, how can we minimize it? So even though they tell us we have to do something, a lot of times we have discretion in how we do it. And so we can think of the different alternatives, A, B, and C. And maybe none of them, the benefits justify the costs, but at least when we put it out for public comment, we can say these are the different alternatives, and in no case does the benefits justify the costs. But Congress is telling us we're going to do it, so we're going to find sort of the least costly way to go through, right? Then what we hope for is that Congress gets the idea and potentially revisits it. So my hope is that at some point Congress revisits some of the bad provisions of Dodd-Frank and thinks through them, right? And by bad provisions, some of them that shouldn't have been in there in the first place, other ones that were well intended but maybe hamper the agencies. And we have a list of things that would give us more discretion in certain areas that we could do it in a less costly way. So, for example, there's the credit rating agencies. After Dodd-Frank, there's a lot of stuff in there that require us to do regulations with the credit rating agencies. And there's this one part that's very, very prescriptive in terms of what our Office of Credit Rating Agencies has to look at on an annual basis. It turns out these list of 8 things, not all of them are important, but some of them just take a lot of time. And so our people in that office would like a little bit more discretion and say, look, you don't have to look at all 8 of these every single year because we'd rather look at some other things, right? And you know, that's another way to sort of think about those particular issues, right? And then hopefully, you know, we can revisit that and go back. But you know, in the end, if Congress is the one that tells us we have to do it, we have to do something on these issues.
We might not know the answer to this question. I want to know what is the intent of Congress generally? Is it to solve the problem or is it to solve the problem?
It's to get reelected.
So that's my question.
Yeah, no, seriously, right? I mean, every member of Congress is trying to get reelected. Now, how do they do that, right? Many of them, it's trying to be good public servants and serve on committees and try to do certain things and try to do what they think is in the public interest, right? Even the well-intentioned ones, right? And so, that's exactly it, right? It's obviously sort of a political dynamic, right? Now, we are an independent agency and we have oversight by the Senate Banking Committee and the House Financial Services Committee. And also the Appropriations Committee controls our budget as well, too. So, you know, we have to listen to them in terms of what they tell us to do, particularly if they pass a law, right? I may not like what's in Dodd-Frank, but it's the law, right? At the same time, Dodd-Frank told us to do almost 100 different rules, right? If some of them are better than other ones, right? I prefer to get the ones done where the benefits outweigh the costs and actually helps us in our core mission. And the ones that don't do that are actually detrimental to our mission. I prefer to put those lower down on the list, right? To actually, you know, maybe buy some time and have Congress sort of revisit these particular issues. Now, 4 years after Dodd-Frank, they haven't yet, but, you know, I'm the eternal optimist that says maybe at some point Congress may revisit some of the things with Dodd-Frank and, you know, even if it's not to repeal certain provisions, at least give the agencies a little more discretion or clarify the intent on some of these things to make our life easier, which I really, really want because, you know, we still have half of the Dodd-Frank rules yet to implement, which means that that's taking up a huge, huge amount of the bandwidth in terms of our resources at the Commission, which is unfortunate because we can't do any discretionary stuff. It's really stretching our resources for our core mission of protecting investors on those sorts of things. So at least we have hope to have a conversation on that. Yes?
Two of the ideas that seem to be done right now are systemic risk
right.
and financial stability.
Uh-huh.
Those are good regulatory notions, and
Well,
I think the attempt to identify non-bank systemic
Yeah.
Yeah. Is that a good thing?
It depends, right? So systemic risk, for those of you who are not familiar, or macro-prudential regulation is a term that some people use, or financial stability, right? So what Dodd-Frank, one of the intentions there was that they looked at, there's certain regulatory agencies like the SEC and the banking regulators that are looking at individual institutions on an individual basis, right? So we look at the broker-dealers and have certain net capital requirements, and then we also have customer protection requirements, so that if a broker-dealer does fail, that those customer assets move somewhere else, right? You have the banking regulators have certain capital requirements, and there's FDIC insurance and all that stuff. But nobody was looking at the system as a whole, right? And so there's this concept of sort of macro-prudential regulation that's there, right? And what we saw during the crisis was that you had the failure of these large banking organizations, which, you know, the holding company has a large bank within them, and then you also have broker-dealers and other sorts of stuff, right? Obviously, the banking regulators want to make sure that they would like banks to never fail because they'd have, you know, detrimental effects and stuff. The broker-dealer regime, which the SEC has, actually failure is an option for broker-dealers for us, right? That's why we have customer segregation requirements, and that's why we have customer protection requirements, and we have what's called the SIPC regime, which is a special bankruptcy regime for broker-dealers to go through and all that sort of stuff, right? And so I have been highly critical of something called the Financial Stability Oversight Council, which was created by Dodd-Frank, which creates this council of the regulators of which the Commission is a part of, but only the chair gets to go to the meetings. And I've actually publicly been asking to go to the meetings, and Treasury won't let me in the building. So it is what it is. But they've been looking at non-bank, potentially systemically important financial institutions. First, they went after insurance companies, and now they were looking at asset management firms. But the justification for looking at asset management firms was a report done by what's called the Office of Financial Research, which was also created by Dodd-Frank. But there's a fundamental misunderstanding in there in terms of who owns the assets. Those are customer assets. They don't belong to the investment advisor. So the failure of the investment advisor has nothing to do with the movement of the assets, right? And then you say, well, what if there's a run on a very, very large asset managers? Couldn't that create disruption in the markets? And people worry about that. And to which I say we had a perfect natural experiment about that about 3 weeks ago when Bill Gross left PIMCO. One of the largest asset managers in the world, in terms of particularly in the bond market in certain sectors, billions of dollars left the firm on a very short-term basis. And those people, for people who are worried about financial stability in terms of, a fund losing money, there's a perfect natural experiment and nothing really happened, right? Now, in terms of non-bank systemically important financial institutions, I've suggested that the FSOC look at 3: the federal government, the Federal Reserve, and the Basel Committee, right? And I actually have, people laugh, right, on this, but I actually have academic research to support all those. Anytime we get near the blown through the debt ceiling, right, people say, well, Congress, if you don't raise the debt ceiling, there's going to be terrible things happen to the markets. Well, perhaps the federal government is a systemically important financial institution, right? They've identified interest rate risk as potentially a risky thing. Who controls interest rate risk? The Federal Reserve. Who's also the world's largest hedge fund at this point with like an almost $4 trillion balance sheet? The Federal Reserve, right? Perhaps we should look at them as a systemically important financial institution. And the other one is the Basel Committee, which sets the bank capital standards and the risk weighting of the assets. As an economist, again, this is think differently, right? Is that what we have is the Basel Committee, which, working with the banking regulators, wants to make sure that the bank balance sheets, they're not too levered on one hand, and there's certain capital charges they apply against all the assets on the asset side of the balance sheet. But what does that do if you have there's certain what's called risk weightings and stuff? It makes bank balance sheets, like individual ones, look very, very similar. So what do you have? You have correlated balance sheets. So in effect, what you have is one very large world balance sheet in terms of banks. And so if there's a crisis in one area, what happens? Bam, everybody goes down together. What you want from a systemic risk perspective is uncorrelated balance sheets, right? And the banking regulators also have this view that some of the activities that were occurring in banks are now occurring in what they call shadow markets, or shadow banks, sorry. But shadow banks are a lot of things that we regulate anyway, like hedge funds and mutual funds and that sort of stuff. You want those things in uncorrelated places that are there. Again, it's sort of a different view. Others share the view, others don't on this particular thing. But it's something that's still sort of up for debate in these. And securities regulators, markets regulators tend to have a fundamentally different view of the world than prudential regulators. Prudential regulators don't want any failure to happen at any cost. And so they're willing to impose huge, huge costs in order to stop a failure. We have a regime where failure is an option. We just want to make sure that customer assets are protected and move over, and then you can go through the SIPC regime. Is that it? Great. Thank you all very much.